Okay. So, Donald, thank you very much for accepting my invite to have you in this interview. And I am currently reading your latest book, as I've mentioned to you earlier. So, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, the Stoic Philosophy of Marcus Aurelius. And you have just recently launched this book, if I'm not mistaken, in April. So,
Uh-huh.
this is a book that talks about the practice of Stoicism. And to
Mhm.
tell you, I've found out about Stoicism in the Enchiridion book, and what my biggest takeaway about it, and I know for sure I also still have a lot of misconceptions about that. But what I know about Stoicism is that you let go of things that you cannot control, and you look at things the way they are without any judgment. So,
Mhm.
Donald, you are a psychotherapist, a trainer, and an author of 6 books on cognitive behavioral therapy and stoicism, including this book about Marcus Aurelius. And you specialize mainly in the integration of Stoic philosophy of the Greeks and Romans, and you integrate it to the modern application of psychology and self improvements. So you've released this book this year, and you walked us through Marcus' life as a Roman emperor and his application in Stoicism. Actually, you've shared a vivid story, providing us a context as to why he is a Stoic. And
Mhm.
can you tell us more about this book that you have written?
Well, like you said, I've written a bunch of books about philosophy and Stoicism. I wrote a book called Teach Yourself Stoicism and the Art of Happiness, and that's kind of an introduction to applying it. And I was invited to write another book about Stoicism. And I thought, oh, I'd like to do that because it's kind of my hobby and I like writing about it. But I thought I've already written an introduction to it, and but there are lots of other books coming out now that are really good introductions. Chuck Chakrapanni, Massimo Paolucci, Ryan Holiday's Daily Stoic. Lots of different books on Stoicism that are very popular now. So I thought I'd like to write a book, but I need to make it different, and I want to make it not only different but also kind of accessible. So how can I kind of square this circle? Do an introduction to Stoicism that's different from all the other introductions to Stoicism and from my previous introduction to Stoicism. And I hit on the idea that I thought the Stoics themselves would have wanted to approach this by using exemplars or role models. And that was often how they taught. So Epictetus in particular, one of the most famous Stoic teachers, the most famous Stoic teacher, often uses examples of famous people like Socrates and Diogenes the Cynic, and also Roman statesmen that he points to and says, look, to students, we can learn from these living examples. And also in the ancient world, philosophy was taught through lectures and dialogues, but philosophy was also taught through anecdotes of a biographical nature. And we particularly have a collection of those in a book called The Lives and Opinions of Eminent Philosophers by a guy called Diogenes Laertius. And that's one of our main sources for ancient philosophy, but it's full of these little quips and anecdotes about the lives of ancient philosophers. And so in the ancient world, people often learned philosophy from these little stories. And the most famous one, for example, is about Diogenes the Cynic. And it's the story that Diogenes, who lived like a beggar and was naked, he lived in a big storage jar outside Athens, and he had nothing. And one day Alexander the Great reputedly was walking past, the most powerful man in the world, the king of Macedonia. And Alexander said, is there anything that I can do for you? Because he greatly admired this man for his wisdom. And Diogenes said, yes, can you just step aside? You're blocking the sun. And that was all that he wanted from him. And allegedly Alexander, as he walked away, said, if I wasn't Alexander, I would like to be Diogenes.
Mm.
And so that's just a little kind of anecdote, right? A little story, but it's probably the most famous one. There are lots of other little stories like that about Diogenes, about Socrates, about the Stoics and other philosophers. And so I thought, well, maybe I can take this tradition of anecdotes and build a book in a similar kind of fashion. It's a good way to teach. The Stoics tend to approach things in this way. And also, I have a young daughter, and I guess when I started writing this book, or started researching it, she would have been maybe about 5 or 6 years old. And I've always told her stories about Greek mythology. And I told her a lot of these stories about Socrates and Diogenes and about philosophy. She loves stories about Socrates. And so I thought maybe I can if she can understand this, maybe I can address similar stories to adults and they would learn from them as well and find them memorable. And then I thought, well, which Stoic could we use as a role model? The founder of Stoicism is Zeno, and there are some good stories about him, but we don't know that much about him. And the Stoic we know most about is the last famous Stoic, who lived nearly 500 years, 5 centuries after Zeno, and that's Marcus Aurelius. And we know a lot about him because he was a hugely powerful and influential man. He was a Roman emperor, and so we have several histories of his reign that tell us about his character and events in his life, and so we can build a bigger story around him. And we also have his private reflections in a book called The Meditations. And that book, The Meditations, happens to begin with a chapter in which Marcus describes his role models, his own adoptive father, the emperor that preceded him, Antoninus Pius, and 16 members of his family and his tutors. So he begins the Meditations by doing the same thing of looking at real people and trying to learn traits from them that he could emulate. And so I decided to do what Marcus was doing in a sense, and build an introduction to Stoicism that used him as a role model and told stories about his life, and then wove those into a discussion of the philosophy that he was applying. So kind of combining the Roman histories that tells about his external life, his reign as emperor, with the Meditations, which tells us about his inner journey, his inner life as a philosopher, and then kind of tying that into modern cognitive behavioral therapy and what modern research tells us about applying these ideas today. And that's kind of basically how I arrived at the book.
Wow. So I really love the background, like the rich history of Marcus Aurelius. And I've been reading through the chapters, and there is this one phrase that keeps on coming up, and that would be the cognitive distancing. So
Yeah.
it's saying that it's not the events that upset us, but the judgment of our events.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking that this is the whole or the core of what the book is about. So can you tell us more about what this cognitive distancing is in
This is
relation
a good
to
question.
Stoicism?
I like this question because cognitive distancing, and this is a term that is modern. We don't really have a technical term from the Stoics for this, but so the concept of modern cognitive behavioral therapy, I should explain before we go into this. CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy is the leading evidence-based form of modern psychotherapy. Originated in the 1950s, and it was inspired by Stoic philosophy. And what Stoic philosophy and cognitive therapy have in common is something called the cognitive theory of emotion. And the cognitive theory of emotion says that our emotions are largely, although not entirely, determined by underlying beliefs. And that's really important, because once we say that, it allows us to try and identify what those beliefs are and put them into words. And then it allows us to evaluate and question those beliefs. And when we question and evaluate beliefs, we can change them, and that can change the emotions that we experience as a result. So we have a whole therapy that follows on from that simple premise that our feelings aren't just feelings, but they're also beliefs. They have truth value. They could be right or wrong. We can evaluate them. We could do philosophy on them in a sense. And the Stoics knew that. And cognitive therapy now has validated that by doing lots of research to show that this is an effective way of approaching things. And it's summed up, it's encapsulated, the cognitive theory of emotion, in the 5th passage from the Enchiridion by Epictetus, which is the most famous quote, I would say, from the whole of the Stoic literature. And it says, it's not things that upset us, but our judgments about them. And, that implies the Stoic belief that ordinarily in life, we fail to distinguish. We naturally tend to fuse our beliefs with our external experience. So if I see someone I don't like, I might think he's a bastard, she's a bitch, this situation's a shitty situation, this is a shitty job, it's a catastrophic situation. And the Stoics would say, well, there's two things here. There's the situation itself, and then there are these value judgments, like, bitch, bastard, catastrophe, shitty, like, that we're projecting onto it. And normally they get fused together, so it seems like one experience. It looks like I'm just describing the person or describing the situation when I say that they're awful or terrible or whatever. And the Stoics would say that we need to realize that these are value judgments that we are imposing on the situation. And we need to prize apart, separate the external event and the value judgments or beliefs that we're projecting onto it. And the way we describe that, the way cognitive therapists used to teach that to their clients, is to say, imagine that you're wearing rose-tinted glasses and you see the whole world as being rose-tinted. Or you could be wearing sad blue glasses and the whole world seems depressing and blue. And it would be like assuming the world actually is blue, or assuming it actually is rose-tinted, like fusing the two things together, rather than realizing that those are lenses and the color is separate from how things actually are externally. And so cognitive distancing would be like taking the glasses off and looking at them, like, or just realizing that you're wearing glasses. And the opposite, which we sometimes call fusion, would be just assuming the world actually is blue. And another thing that can help us there is just realizing that other people see it differently. So I might say the world is sad and blue, someone else might tell me it's rose-tinted. And if I recognize that they're viewing it differently, that helps me to realize that these are all just subjective attitudes or lenses that we're projecting onto events, and it could be different. So the other way we describe this is that cognitive distancing, separating the color or the value judgment from events, gives us a kind of flexibility. It allows us to realize that there might be other lenses we could put on, or other values that we could project onto situations, other beliefs or attitudes that we could adopt towards them. And this idea goes all the way back, at least as far as Socrates. We find it in the Socratic dialogues of Plato and of Xenophon. So I think it possibly goes back to the real Socrates himself, actually. And the Stoics assimilate it, and it becomes a central part of their philosophy and of their therapy, and the basis of modern cognitive behavioral therapy. But it's just the realization that often, particularly when we're upset, we're angry, we're depressed, we're anxious, what we're responding to isn't the event itself, but it's the event fused with certain value judgments, and those value judgments could be different.
And this is where it also brings me to one of the common misconceptions about Stoicism is becoming emotionless and just really rigid about things. And one thing that made me confused about it is, like, there was one chapter in the book that somehow like tells us about journaling, and I tried to do that, and it's just like listing down the things that has happened for me through the day without any adjective or any sense of emotion in it. And while I was writing it, there's one realization that came to me, that the story of my day looked so bland. And then that was me already putting emotion and description that it's bland. But I'm just supposed to be just stating what happened to my day is. And it brings me to think that the emotions and then the judgments that we place it makes the story dramatic, or let's say joyful, or it gives the color as to what kind of story or tone that we want to put in. So what I wanted to ask you about that is, I'd like for you to clarify that misconception about taking out emotions from Stoicism, because I was also surprised to find out, like, early in the book, you've mentioned that Stoicism does not mean that way exactly, but we also have, or we value the relationships we have socially. And of course, to build relationships, we tend to be affectionate, we show love and care, and that's a lot of emotions there.
Well, there's a couple of things I'd like to say about that. And again, I'll start off with a little bit of an aside, and that is that, one of the reasons that I wanted to write a book on Stoicism that focuses on a real person is that I find there's certain misconceptions about Stoicism that you can try and address theoretically. And it's kind of a hard slog, so you have to kind of argue with people about the interpretation of the text and what it means and so on. But often it's easier to deal with these misconceptions if you can just point at an example. And if we point at Marcus Aurelius, for instance, or really any of the historical Stoics, we can say they weren't unemotional people. And they weren't passive or inert people. They had very active lives. They were very determined to pursue certain goals in life. And Marcus was a very friendly, very loving, very affectionate man. He was in certain respects a very cheerful and good-humoured man. His goal wasn't to be like Mr. Spock or a robot or anything. And so pointing to the example sometimes helps to kind of show that there's something wrong in this misconception. Now, one of the reasons that we have this is that language kind of often changes its meaning over the centuries. Like the meaning of words kind of evolves or degrades over time. And in particular, the names of Greek philosophies have kind of degraded their meaning over time. And we usually show that by when we write, for example, about Stoicism, the philosophy, we use a capital S. And when we use Stoicism in the kind of modern, watered-down sense as an unemotional coping style, it's usually written with a lowercase s. So Stoicism, the personality trait or coping style, which suppresses or conceals emotion, lowercase Stoicism, is kind of only loosely related to the idea of Stoicism, the Greek philosophy, which we capitalize. And that's true of Epicureanism. So today, to be an Epicurean just means to be like a gourmand, to enjoy lots of different foods and stuff. And that's very different from what Epicurean philosophy meant. Skepticism, academic, cynic, like all of these words kind of relate to Greek philosophy, but they change their meaning over time. So we usually distinguish between the capitalized and the lowercase version. So people think Stoicism means being unemotional because that's what the lowercase Stoicism has come to mean over 2,000 years later. But the Greek Stoics and the Roman Stoics distinguished between unhealthy emotions, which they called the passions, and the word they use, pathos, is the root of our word passion. It's also related to the word passive, and it's also related to pathology, as in psychopathology. And when the Romans tried to translate these Greek terms into Latin, they struggled about whether to translate this word pathos as emotion or to translate it as disease, because it means kind of both. It means an unhealthy or pathological emotion. That's what they're talking about. So the emotions that the Stoics wanted to deal with or get rid of were pathological ones or unhealthy ones. They thought it was okay to have other types of emotion. There are emotions that the Stoics thought were good, bad, and indifferent. So some emotions they thought were natural and indifferent, or neither good nor bad. Some emotions they thought were pathological and unhealthy, and some emotions they thought were actually healthy and part of our optimum functioning. Their ideal, their optimum, which they call the sage or the sophos, the perfect wise man or wise woman would experience a range of healthy and rational and adaptive emotions. And I guess the core of that really is, for me anyway, I think really the core of it is a sort of feeling of love, which is the precursor in some ways of the sort of love that you find in early Christianity and Christian ethics. It's a kind of philanthropic or a brotherly love that the Stoics want to cultivate. They think that the wise man would experience a kind of rational, healthy, kind of brotherly love that they see as the ideal. So their ideal figure, as Marcus Aurelius describes in the first book of the Meditations, he says the Stoic ideal is to be free from unhealthy passions and yet full of love. And the word he uses actually in Greek is philostorgia, which means the kind of love that a parent would have for their children. So that's what he thinks the ideal would be like. Not someone unemotional, but someone free from unhealthy emotions and full of this kind of brotherly or paternal love.
Yeah, so this is also a very weird concept for me, like as a woman talking about love, like there's some form of attachment there, and the feeling of I want affection, I want to receive that. But then there would be some times that other people, your partner or your family, will disappoint you. And is it right to say that with Stoicism, the way you look at it is that you love them and yet you don't expect anything from them? So if you don't
Yeah.
expect something, then you don't end up being disappointed in case they don't do what you expect.
Well, I should, again, a slight aside, I should explain that the Stoics stand in the Socratic tradition, and
Mm,
in many ways, they're very heavily indebted to Socrates. So we find in Socrates, though, in the dialogues of Plato and Xenophon, we find more arguments to justify certain positions. And in the Stoics, we get a kind of bullet point version of how do you live this as a philosophy of life. So we get it similar aspects of the philosophy approached from a different perspective. And in the Socratic tradition, in Socrates and in the Stoics, the idea is that it's more important to love than it is to be loved. And so the wise man or wise woman loves in a way that's relatively indifferent to whether it's reciprocated or not. And the easiest way to look at that is, again, if you look at paternal love, love for children. So there might be times that your children are having tantrums and doing things that are quite challenging or upsetting, but a good parent, a virtuous parent, would still love them just the same. They'd be accepting of the fact, that you can't make your love conditional on whether your kids are being nice to you. If you're a good parent, you would love them regardless, and you want the best for them regardless. But I should say, well, normally when you have this conversation, people will say, well, does that mean that you would allow other people to kind of exploit you or take advantage of you if you were loving them in this kind of unconditional way? And the answer to that is also no. Because the Stoic love isn't just this kind of feeling of a kind of warm glow or something like that, or kind of wanting to be close to someone. Stoic love is more philosophical. It's something a bit more profound and nuanced than that. So like with Socrates before them, the Stoics would say that to really love someone is to respect them as an individual, to kind of accept them warts and all as another rational being who's capable of virtue, but also to want them to flourish, like to want to improve them. And really, although it might sound odd at first, what that really comes down to is that we want other people to become wise and virtuous. And the implication of that for Socrates and the Stoics is that we would also want them to become our friends, but genuine friends. We'd want them to act wisely and virtuously towards us, so that, if we imagine that on a societal scale, it would be everyone helping everyone else in order for the whole of society to become enlightened and virtuous and to live harmoniously. So there's this kind of utopian social ideal that the Stoics have at the same time, but it's based on the idea that to love someone is to want them to improve and flourish and become a better person. And that would mean that Stoic love isn't shouldn't hurt you. Like, if it's damaging you, then it's not really true love in the philosophical or the Stoic sense.
Interesting. So what do you think, or what do you believe is the Stoic action would be for someone who does not mean the good for you? So, for example, Marcus has a brother who is his co-emperor, right? And then he was not the best role model of a virtuous person. And so can you tell me about that part of being close to a person who is the exact opposite of what Stoicism is?
Yeah. So Marcus's adoptive brother, who confusingly was also like a kind of son to him, because I think he was about almost 10 years younger than him, and he married Marcus's daughter, right? So he was technically his son-in-law and also his adoptive brother. But people say Marcus viewed him like a son, and he was his co-emperor, but he was junior in status to him. So technically he was kind of equal, but he served Marcus kind of like a lieutenant or a subordinate. And so these kind of like nuances to the relationship. And in the meditations at the beginning, where Marcus reflects on the virtues of his friends and teachers, he says of Lucius Verus that he was affectionate and loyal and he inspired Marcus to improve his own character. Now that's artfully vague, because did he inspire Marcus to improve his character because he set a good example, or because he set such a bad example that Marcus thought, he's inspiring me to be different from him, right? And he's very vague, like, so he's not heaping praise on him like he does to his adoptive father. It's quite guarded. He's kind of damning him with faint praise in a sense, but he does find positive things to say about him. So that's the first thing, is that Marcus is able to identify, even in this quite degenerate individual. I think it's safe to say he's the way he's described makes him sound like he was possibly an alcoholic, and lived quite a chaotic and self-indulgent life, and he was a failure as an emperor. He failed in his duties to the empire, but nevertheless Marcus is able to identify aspects of him that are worthy of admiration. And this is part of the Stoic thing. It's not to be naive, but to try and find qualities in individuals that we could encourage, like that we could reinforce and that we could learn from. There's a famous anecdote about this where Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, heard some young men overheard them discussing an earlier philosopher, a precursor of the Stoics called Antisthenes, who died a couple of generations earlier, and they were talking about a book that he'd written. And one of the young men was being very arrogant, and he was just doing a hatchet job in this book, saying it was garbage, and he was picking apart all the flaws in this book of Antisthenes. And Zeno said to him, having studied this book, do you think there's anything in it of value? Is there anything in this book that could teach us how to become better, or teach us about virtue? And that the young man who'd been kind of showing off and talking a lot was dumbfounded. He's like, I can't really think of anything positive that we could take from it. And Zeno said, shouldn't you be ashamed, therefore, to be attacking it and critiquing it and pulling it apart when you haven't, first of all, identified what bits of it are actually good or valuable? So the Stoics say that we should, first of all, focus on even if it's only one or two small bits, like what bits we can actually extract, because it's potentially, if we just we can critique anything, and if we just focus on the negative and criticize things, then potentially we don't learn anything from them. And even in people like Lucius Verus, who are quite degenerate individuals, there might be aspects of their character that are nevertheless admirable and that we can take something positive from. And also, by focusing on the best in other people, it allows us to kind of find ways to try and bring that out of them more and encourage their strengths. So not being naive, but focusing on opportunities for learning and growth in other people. And I guess that's kind of what a good teacher would potentially do, rather than focusing exclusively on the weaknesses of students, would be try to identify their strengths and bring those out first. So the other thing that tells us about this is there's a passage in the Meditations where Marcus, an extraordinary passage, it's book 11, passage 18, if I remember rightly, and in it Marcus talks about how he copes with anger, and he lists 10 different coping strategies, cognitive strategies, thinking strategies for dealing with anger, your own anger. So it shows the extent of the repertoire of Stoic techniques for therapy. He calls them gifts from Apollo, the god of healing. And so he goes through this extensive list of different mental strategies for dealing with anger. And at one point he says, look, what happens if you're dealing with somebody who's acting badly, and they're doing things that are offensive and stuff like that? And he imagines, and he's writing to himself in his own notes. He's saying, this is how I should deal with it. And so he tells us, he actually kind of puts it into words, and this is what he says. He says that he would take that person aside, and he would try not to embarrass them in front of other people. He would try not to lecture them and talk down to them or patronize them, but he would try to talk to them in an understanding and in a friendly and a kind of compassionate way. And the message that he would try to get across to them actually echoes two of the main principles that he tried to learn himself for coping with his own anger. So he wants them to become wise. He's trying to teach them two of the key elements of Stoicism that he feels benefited him personally. And they are, number one, he says to the other person, look, we're not meant for this. This isn't what nature intended us to be like, to be at loggerheads, because the Stoics are committed to this idea that nature intended human beings to be social and to live in communities and families and to do that well, and to live harmoniously in a sense. So he says, we're not meant for this, my son. Nature intended us actually to have good relationships. It gave us the ability to form friendships, and so we should do that to the best of our ability and live in harmonious families and communities. We have that potential. We should maximize it and make the most of it. And he said, then he follows that by saying, you're not harming me, you're just harming yourself. And this is another Stoic principle that says that when we're angry with somebody, our anger doesn't really harm them. Although our anger is kind of a vengeful, the Stoics think the underlying desire is that we want to hurt the other person or damage them somehow to get back at them or take revenge on them. But anger doesn't really harm the other person. It destroys us, though. Anger itself, the Stoics thought, is like a toxin. It's a form of temporary madness, they call it. So we're damaging our own character, and it's really the worst kind of harm that we could do to ourselves. We're allowing ourselves to go temporarily insane, they thought, when we allow ourselves to indulge in anger. So that wounds us more deeply than any kind of injury to our body, than if we lost a finger or something. We're actually hurting ourselves at the very core of our being when we allow anger to control us. And so he believes this, and he wants to teach this to the other person. Now, he also, because he says my son, he could be talking figuratively, but it's possible he's thinking of his son Commodus when he writes that passage. So he says, my son, we're not meant for this. You're not harming me, you're just harming yourself by getting angry in this way. And that's a little snippet of how he thinks we should parent, perhaps, or deal with friends or acquaintances that are becoming hostile.
Right.
In another passage, he also says that when we're dealing with offensive people, in a more general sense, he says, look, either educate them or put up with them.
Sorry,
So
educate.
He says in another passage, either educate or learn to live with them. So the Stoics have this idea called the reserve clause that says that we should set goals for ourselves, external goals, but because, as you mentioned earlier, Stoicism is founded on something called the dichotomy of control, so making a clear distinction between things that are up to us and everything else, or things that aren't up to us, things that happen to us. The Stoics would say, look, we don't control our children completely, we don't control other people, so we can try to educate them. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So we can try to educate people, and we should try to educate them, but we have to add a caveat that says fate willing or God permitting, or insofar as it's possible. That's what the Stoics call the reserve clause. So we try to do something while accepting that it's not entirely up to us. And so the Stoics are respond with equanimity whether they achieve success or failure in terms of these external events. So Marcus would say, I'll do my best to educate people and improve their character, but I accept that you can't always succeed in doing that. And if I can't succeed in educating someone and making them my friend and improving their character, then I have to accept that that's outside of my control. It's just something that I have to live with. And it's just like the weather. It's just one of the challenges in life that I'm going to have to work around or put up with.
Yeah, that sounds to me like what a real friend is. Their flaws and you don't tolerate them, but out of love, you tell them, hey, that you need to get your act together. And you don't actually just lecture them. If they keep on doing it, then we accept that, okay, there's nothing to do about that. And then that's all about them. And how would I say that? If they suffer through the consequences, we'll just still be there for them to support them in whatever way we can still continually have. So now it brings me on to the question about the personal aspects of you and Stoicism. So when or before you found out about Stoicism, what do you think is the biggest lesson that you've had, which you feel that you hope that you could have lived through it, or you could have known Stoicism and regretted because you did not do it?
So if I look back in my life, if I think of a situation where I wish that I'd been able to draw on Stoicism, actually I talk about this in the book, and it was something that happened to me early in life. So if I think about my life, I was fairly contented as a child. And then my life really changed quite dramatically when I was about 13 or 14 years old. My father developed lung cancer, and he passed away when I was still in high school. And when that happened, I dealt with it quite badly, and my family dealt with it quite badly. And it kind of made me sort of drop out of school and get into trouble with the police. And, because I became quite depressed and kind of disillusioned with life. I didn't know how to handle the situation. I was kind of left without a father figure or a role model in life. And my mother was really struggling to cope with things as well. And so that, I think, was probably the toughest period of my life. I got it over with kind of early, I suppose. That was one of the toughest things that I've been through. And as a child, I just didn't really know. I didn't have any idea of ways to cope with it, what was a healthy response. And if I'd known more about Stoicism, or maybe if the people around me had kind of known about some of these ideas, some of these concepts and techniques, I think that would have helped me a lot in dealing with the situation without being so overwhelmed by it. And actually, the Stoics often used to help friends who were bereaved. There's a whole genre of philosophical literature called the consolatio, or consolation literature. And we have several, I think we have like about 5 or 6 letters from Seneca to friends and family members who are typically bereaved. And Seneca is offering them Stoic ideas, concepts, techniques to help them cope better with bereavement. So Stoics, like, to come back to something you said earlier about being unemotional, Seneca actually says, I'm not telling you not to grieve, but that there are natural limits to grief. It's something that nature's intended us to experience, but then to eventually move beyond. And so the problem would be if grief turns into clinical depression, as we might say today. There's a grieving process. It's natural. Seneca might say even animals grieve. Some animals grieve the loss of their young, but then eventually they adapt and they move on. So he said there's a kind of natural process. There are reasonable limits, and when we cope philosophically with grief, we're bigger than it. We can assimilate it and move beyond it, rather than being broken by it and left in a bad state, or left in depression. And so that's a good example of how the Stoics kind of want us to deal in a more healthy way with emotions. They're not saying that we should completely remove all of our emotions, just adapt to them better. So that's probably the main thing that I mentioned in the book, actually. And this is coincidentally, Marcus also lost his father, although at a much earlier age. His father died when Marcus was about 3 or 4 years old.
You mean his real father, and
Real
then
father,
now he has his
father.
adopted father, Antoninus. So it brings me also to the question about like how you found out about Stoicism. Was it more of a personal journey for you, or did you have someone like Rusticus or Antoninus that somehow has led you to find Stoicism?
Well, funnily enough, the way that I got into it, if I go right back to the very beginning, like my father was a Freemason, like most of my friends' fathers in my hometown in Scotland. Our national bard in Scotland, Robert Burns, was a master mason, and so it's part of the culture of my hometown. And Freemasonry is a kind of non-denominational religious society that's influenced by Hellenistic or Greek philosophy. And it adopts, for example, the 4 cardinal virtues of Stoic philosophy and Socratic philosophy and other ideas that would become familiar to me later from the Greek literature. So my father left behind some of his Freemasonic books, and I began reading them. I couldn't understand half of it, and it got me to read the Bible, and then I started to read other stuff like different world religions, the Bhagavad Gita, the Tao Te Ching. I read the Upanishads. I read the Christian Gnostic Gospels. And actually, it was through studying Christian Gnosticism that I saw more and more references in that Greek literature, early Christian Greek literature. It was referring to Neoplatonic philosophy, Greek philosophy. And one of the early Christian texts that we have, a collection of Christian Gospels that was found in Egypt, a place called Nag Hammadi, there's actually a section from Plato's Republic in the book, along with the Christian Gospels. So these early Christians were reading Plato. And, you know, Plato could have been in the Bible. They had texts from Plato's Republic in their Bible alongside their other texts. And other texts that were very heavily influenced by Platonic ideas. So that got me into studying Plato and other Greek philosophy. And then I studied philosophy at university. And when I left university, normally one of the few major schools of ancient philosophy that you don't study in an undergraduate curriculum is Stoicism. And so I did 4 years at Aberdeen University doing philosophy, and I was trying to find a philosophy of life, and I couldn't quite find something. I ended up looking at existentialism and how that related to psychoanalysis. I did my master's degree in that at Sheffield University, and it didn't quite click. I thought I've almost found what I'm looking for, but not quite really. And then I read, I went back to the Gnostics, and I read a book on Plotinus, the most famous Neoplatonist. And it's by a guy called Pierre Hadot, a French academic. And Hadot wrote this book about the spiritual exercises that exist in Plotinus. And he said many of them are derived from the Stoics, who came a few generations earlier. And he'd also written several books about Hellenistic philosophy in general that talk a lot about the Stoics, and I read those as well. And so it was through the works of Pierre Hadot, namely, What is Ancient Philosophy? Philosophy is a Way of Life. And he has a book that it's a detailed analysis of the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius that Hadot wrote, called The Inner Citadel. So that in particular led me deeper into the study of Stoicism, introduced me to the Stoics. And at the same time, I recognized the connection between Stoicism and cognitive therapy. And so everything started to click together and fall into place for me. I was interested in meditation. I was interested in psychotherapy, and I was interested in philosophy. And it frustrated me that I couldn't quite get these things to click together neatly. I felt like they were kind of three jostling things, like slightly separate. And then I discovered the Stoics, and suddenly they all just clicked together and became one thing, unified in my mind. Stoicism, CBT, it covered my interest in meditation, psychotherapy and self-help, and philosophy. And that was... how long ago? Over about 25 years ago or something now, my life has been different ever since then. I've never changed my mind about that. You know, I've carried on feeling that Stoicism brought together all of my main interests, and I guess I'll always be committed to studying it for that reason, because it took these things that I was trying to combine, and it suddenly brought them together for me very neatly.
Wow. It really sounds like you've been very, very well read, and throughout your experience, it's revolved around you for how long? 25 years, right?
I think it's like 25 years roughly now. Yeah, almost 25 years.
Wow. Okay. So if you could share, like, what does a day look like for you?
What does a day look like for me? In terms of, I guess I can talk about the work that I do in Stoicism. I at the moment I tend to, for the past few years, I travel, and I don't really kind of have a permanent base as such. So I live in Toronto at the moment, and so my lifestyle is a little bit unusual. You know, some of my friends say that they think the way that I live is like a cynic philosopher or something, like a kind of traveling, wandering philosopher or something. So I travel around. I spend some of my time. Recently, I've been spending some time in Toronto in Canada, and some time in Athens in Greece. And I have very few possessions. Like, I like to travel lightly. Everything I own can fit inside, like, that's one suitcase probably, or maybe one or two suitcases. And I live pretty simply. Like, I don't own a car. I don't own a house. I eat pretty simple food. I eat the same thing every day. I eat Greek dakos, which is like a kind of like salad with bread and stuff. I get up in the morning, I have a cold shower every morning, I exercise, I fast. These are all things that modern proponents of Stoicism tend to do. So my routine in terms of work changes a little bit, because when you write books, you often have to do podcasts and interviews and stuff. And, you know, you maybe go and give talks, and then maybe write articles, and then sometimes you're planning books, and then sometimes you're actually in the middle of writing them or editing them. So the work that I'm doing varies a bit from day to day. Sometimes I do coaching over Skype. Sometimes I'm organising events like the conference. So I do a variety of things that are kind of all related, but they can be different things. But generally I'll go and I'll work in the local library, you know, wherever I am, somewhere like that. And, you know, like I'll be writing articles or working on a book or something like that, or running an online course. And then in terms of Stoic techniques, I try to practice Stoic techniques throughout the day. You know, I particularly like in the evening, I'll usually think about the day, and I'll kind of rate myself from 0 to 10, how well I thought I did in terms of trying to live in accord with my values. And I'll ask myself, what did I do badly? Did I do anything badly? Did I do anything particularly well? Is there anything that I could do differently the next time, or do differently tomorrow? And then in the morning, I'll kind of plan my day, and I will usually try and exercise the reserve clause. So I'll plan to do certain things while accepting that I might fail. So I'll do my best, you know, but don't always demand that I should succeed. I'm open to the fact that things don't always turn out that you expected. And there's another thing that I do. I haven't done it for a little while actually, but I do often take a technique from cognitive therapy, and I have a daily planner that's divided up into half-hour segments throughout the whole day. And I'll plan what I'm doing sometimes in every half-hour segment throughout the day, and then I'll record beside it in a second column what I actually did. And what I learned from that is that my most basic learning from that I'm glad it took me years to learn, is that my preconception of how long it takes to do different tasks is often very wrong. And it takes me a lot longer to answer emails than I usually assume. And reading takes me longer than I would normally assume. But writing often takes me less time than I would assume. So my ideas about what's going to take the most time are sometimes kind of skewed. And it's by recording how much time I actually spent on each thing. I realised that and became more able to set more realistic goals for what I'm going to achieve each day.
That's interesting. Like, now you pointed out about time, and then our concept of time, that it somehow can be longer or shorter depending on whether we're waiting or we're doing something and are in the flow. And so I'm actually curious to find out, like, what does the Stoics think about the concept for time?
Mm-hmm. Well, the Stoics have some quite strange ideas about time, actually. First of all, and they have this grand metaphysical theory, which they perhaps inherited from earlier philosophers, called the eternal recurrence. And it's kind of well known because the German philosopher Nietzsche adopted the same idea. And the Stoics like to believe that time was circular, and the universe begins at a certain point and ends at a certain point, and then the whole thing happens again an infinite number of times. So they believe that every moment is both transient and eternal. Like the moment that you're experiencing right now will be gone in the blink of an eye, but it's going to happen an infinite number of times again in the future. So we don't tend to talk. I mean, that's really kind of almost a mystical sort of part of their philosophy that we don't really discuss that much, but they did have this odd belief. But what's more relevant perhaps to modern therapy and self-help is that the Stoics believed that we often project our minds into the future, and we live our lives as if we're kind of living in the past or living in the future. And they thought we should remain more grounded in the present moment. And they thought, although we should plan for the future and learn from the past, we should kind of be more grounded, more centered in the here and now, because that's where our locus of control is. So some things are up to us, other things are not. The past isn't up to me because it's gone, it's already happened, I can't change it. The future isn't up to me yet. I can plan for it, but only by changing what I'm doing right now. But it's not here yet, so I don't control it. The only thing I really control is what I'm doing right now. And so the Stoics think I need to keep coming back to how I'm using my mind and how I'm using my body right now from moment to moment. And they thought that's how we should live our lives, although learning from the past and preparing for the future, but focusing on what. Because if we don't do that, they thought we become forgetful. We lose our minds. We get lost in the past or lost in the future, and we forget what we're actually doing right now. We fail to notice how we're using our minds and bodies and how we're actually living.
So this also because looking at only having the present can also be misconstrued as hedonistic, right? So if I'm just in the present, I don't care about the past nor the future, so I will just live the life that I would have regardless of any consequences. However, with Stoicism, we look at it in an interconnected way, as if there's a bigger picture here, that even if I'm staying in the present, I know what I have to do out of my past, and also I brace that up for what I want to achieve in the future, but then I still have my entire focus in the present moment. So this is seems to me some form of a mindfulness practice, or they stay into the present moment.
Yeah, and I think, this is I'm going to say something controversial. I think that when Westerners kind of became interested in Buddhism and other Eastern philosophies and traditions, and they kind of translated them into Western terms and Western language. So, for example, when we talk about Buddhism, we use the word mindfulness in the West, and we talk about it being a here and now philosophy. And here and now, actually, the English phrase is derived from a medieval Latin expression, hic et nunc. And so this idea of the here and now and of mindfulness are Western philosophical concepts that people have forgotten where they came from. But they're still kind of vaguely in our minds and in our language. And so when we read Buddhist texts, maybe Taoist texts and so on, we kind of translate them into Western language. And we do that by using Western philosophical concepts. We draw on Stoicism and other forms of Hellenistic philosophy without even realizing that we're doing it in order to interpret Eastern philosophical texts. It's kind of interesting that we tend to do that. And so in Stoicism, we actually have a word that pretty much means mindfulness. It's prosoche. In Greece, it's funny because it's the word that's used on signs. If someone has a guard dog, I guess, it kind of means caution or watch out. It means pay attention. So if you were on the subway, there might be a sign that says prosoche, be careful you don't step over the edge of the platform. Or if someone has a guard dog, it might have a picture of an Alsatian dog and it might say prosoche, caution, guard dog or something. But in Stoic philosophy, it means pay attention to your own faculty of judgment, your hegemonicon, your ruling faculty. So pay attention to your mind. Or mindfulness, we would say. And so there's this word that the Stoics use to refer to the continual awareness of the way that we use our mind. And we could just call that mindfulness now. People tend to say that's Stoic mindfulness.
So there's really something about language and how we see it. And anyway, I would like to move on now more on you finding out about your craft. How was your experience in writing, and what made you decide that you wanted to start writing a book or publishing a book?
Well, I like to tell people that I'm not a writer, although I do write books. So, because I never really planned to become a writer. When I was a kid and I went to school, I wasn't really good at a lot of things, and but I was kind of naturally quite good at writing, funnily enough. So I got encouraged to do that as a small child at school. And then I kind of dropped out of school and stuff after my father died. And I didn't really plan to do any more writing. And I studied philosophy and I qualified as a therapist. And the first book that I wrote, it was really, I had a lot of notes, huge amount of notes that I compiled on Stoicism and cognitive therapy. And I wanted to just kind of make sense of it all. And so for my own benefit, like the British Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, said the best way to learn about a subject is to write a book about it, which is a paradox, because normally we think the best way to learn about a subject is to read a book about it. He said, no, the best way is to write a book about it. And so I thought the best way to kind of make sense out of all these notes and ideas, because nobody else had really written a book comparing Stoicism and CBT, I thought I'll write a book about it to help me understand it. And I've just actually finished doing the second revised edition of that book, incidentally, which is the philosophy of cognitive behavioral therapy. That should come out maybe in the next 6 months or so, a second edition of that book. So I wrote this book, and then, you know, when you write a book, you're kind of giving birth to a child, and you're putting something into the world, you're creating something, you're putting it out in the world. It's like you're putting a message in a bottle and you're throwing it into the sea. And so once you write a book, you know, people would get in touch with me, and you know, they'd invite me to write other things and to write other books. And so I was asked to write various other books after that, and now I've ended up writing about 6. I'm on my book number 7 now, so it starts a kind of chain reaction. And I never really planned to be a writer as such. I just kind of stumbled into doing it, and I guess now I've kind of got a little bit more experienced at doing it. And it's now it's become the main thing that I do, actually. I guess as I get older, and I travel more, it's convenient to write, because I can do it anywhere. So I could be on the plane traveling to Athens and be writing on the plane or whatever. So it's convenient for my lifestyle and stuff. And I still, when I write, I try to write for myself as well as for an audience, and I write about difficult ideas because it gives me an opportunity to try and clarify them for myself. And that's kind of how I approach it. And other things, I guess, are that when I write stuff, I like to read it aloud. And so what I've started to do is, and I did for this book, I'll read it aloud myself, and then when I have the kind of final manuscript, I'll get somebody to read the whole thing aloud back to me, and I'll have lots of bits of paper. I have a printout of the manuscript, and someone will read it to me, and I'll go through and I'll make marks in the manuscript while I'm listening to them read it. And that helps me get a sense of how the whole book flows, and also how certain sentences actually sound when they're read aloud, which I feel is important, even if you're just reading something. But also, I didn't realize this, but I actually, by coincidence, more and more books now are sold as audiobook anyway. And I did the audio recording for this book in a studio in Toronto. And so, you know, by focusing more on how the book sounds when it's read aloud, I think that wasn't the intention, but that helped me make a better job, I guess, and prepare more for the audiobook version of it, which I think in for this particular book is maybe even selling more copies than the hardback or the ebook version. So that's kind of how I tend to approach things. Oh, and also sometimes I'll tell my daughter because my background is kind of academic. I've always tried to simplify things, to kind of struggle against the tendency to become too academic or too technical. And you know, it reminds me actually of, I heard Keith Richards, the guitarist in the Rolling Stones, once explain something quite startling. So Keith Richards said that when the Stones, you know, the Rolling Stones song Satisfaction, right? I think it was their first big hit. And Keith Richards said that he'd originally planned that song to have like orchestration. So it was a much more complex composition. He said that's how he normally writes songs. You know, there were like violins and things and all sorts going on. And then the record company said, no, we need you to record it tomorrow. Like, so you just need to go into a studio and do like simplify it, the bare minimum. And so he had to bring it right back down to a more simplified version. So he starts off with a very complex musical composition, and then he strips it down and makes a simplified version of it. And that's often how I write. I'll start writing a more kind of complex version, and then I'll rewrite it and try and simplify it. And one way I'll do that is I'll talk to my daughter, who's now 8, I talked to her about, even when she was 5, I'd tell her about Socrates and stuff. And if she could understand it, then I'd think, okay, it's simple enough for anybody to read, hopefully. And so she wouldn't understand everything that's in that book. But, you know, for a lot of things, like I try to find stories to illustrate things that even a small child would be able to understand. And I would discuss them with my friends and discuss them with my daughter. And that was part of the writing process.
Right. Like for what I understand about learning or education is like first you read the book or you listen to an audiobook or listen to a lecture, and then the next level would be for you to articulate it and express it. And now if you can explain it in a way that is simpler and can have the other person understand, then that's the way for you to know that you have finally understood what you were supposed to learn from. So that's my understanding about learning and articulating. And you've mentioned earlier about like you taking an audio recording for your audiobook and then that it's selling more. And it reminded me about the book cover. And I'm curious to know actually like where this book cover design came from, because like what I took notice, well, right from the color with the black background was that Marcus was wearing an earphones. So this is one of the factors that I was curious, like, okay, what's happening here? Why did Marcus ended up having earphones? And
well, that gets into how publishing works, because normally actually it's the publishing house that choose the cover design. So that was the Macmillan or St. Martin's who chose that design, and I said I liked it. Actually, I really liked the font and the colours. I wasn't so sure about the statue at first, so we changed that. They had another statue and we changed it. And they wanted to put earbuds in just because they wanted to communicate the idea that it was an ancient thing, a classical thing, but it was also, there was something modern about it as well. We're trying to make it relevant to the modern world. So that wasn't my design, it was theirs, I have to say. But I wasn't sure at first, but then it kind of grew on me and I like it now. But I did choose the title. I don't think they were super keen on the title to begin with, and then they sort of warmed to it, and now they like it because well, now that the book's out there, people can respond to the title and they think it's an interesting title. So there's a bit of give and take between an author and the publisher when it comes to the title and the book design. But in my experience anyway, it's usually the image on the cover is usually more determined by the publisher, because they have ideas about what they think will make a book sell, what will make it popular. They have some input on the content, but they're particularly interested in the title and the cover design, because that's what sells the book, if you like. We had it's interesting, a lot of people kind of, when they see the cover, they want to try and imagine what he's listening to, like what song. Maybe he's listening to the Rolling Stones, like, so they try to imagine what songs Marcus Aurelius would be listening to on his earbuds.
Why not post the question in the Stoic group about like creating a playlist for what Marcus Aurelius is listening to?
Oh, we did that actually. We asked people we had a competition like for a sweepstake, and I think we asked people to suggest, and then we picked one, and we gave the prize was a copy of the audio book, if I remember rightly. So we have these little competitions sometimes, but it got people thinking. That's the main thing. There's a bit of give and take, but I find that the bigger a book is, the bigger the publishing house is, the kind of more people are involved in writing and editing a book. And so, and that varies from one author to another. I've seen authors who have written books and their editor changed a lot in the book, and even wrote whole paragraphs, and at one extreme. And then at other extreme, there are authors who won't really accept any feedback. And I think Nassim Taleb, you probably heard of, he says he doesn't like copy editors reading his work and suggesting changes. But normally there's a kind of process that you go through with several rounds of editing and proofreading. And so most of that book is in my own words, although, an editor might ask me to rephrase things or cut certain parts. And occasionally, one or two places there might be a phrase or a sentence that was suggested by an editor. And also the other odd thing about writing for an American publisher is because I'm British, there might be phrases that I would use in British English that Americans would find odd, or there's phrases that an editor might suggest that I think that's not something I would say. It sounds strange to me. So but I have to kind of sometimes adapt my writing to suit an American audience, because that's the biggest audience that the book is being sold to.
Yeah, what is also common theme that I noticed about the book is that it's a marriage between the history and the modern times. It gives a practical way for us to apply self-development in the 21st century. And I also feel like maybe that's why this book cover with the earphones resonates so much to the younger generation, and most especially for me. And I see that this is a history or a biography book, and at the same time it's a self-development book as well. And I'd like to link that up with that connectedness between the past and the present, the statue, and then the earphones, and then even how you have created a community in social media to educate people more about Stoicism, and as well as introduce your book to the community. So I am interested to know what it is that you are trying to build, let's say, in the Stoicism group, and what is the potential that you find there?
Well, it started off as an accidental thing. It's kind of organic, So if you're a writer or do any creative things, you kind of produce lots of things. So if you're a writer, you might be working on a book and you write a chapter and then you think, I'm not going to use that in the book. So I find myself putting lots of little bits and pieces on a blog. I'd be working on an idea for a book or a course that I was designing, and then ideas that I kind of abandoned or that didn't fit in, I'd often just turn into blog posts. And that was kind of how I started. And then over the years and years, it just kind of gradually built up an audience. And then these things kind of become exponential, because once you pass a certain point, so it starts off, you have a little trickle of followers, and maybe have 1,000, a few thousand. And then once you reach a certain point, a community will start to form a sort of momentum of its own. So to begin with, you maybe just posting things. And then once you have maybe 1,000 members, more of them are starting to post things themselves and start their own conversations. And then maybe you have a few thousand more and they're starting to share the group and tell other people about the group. And it kind of goes through this process of evolution. But it starts off just with a little trickle of people kind of learning about content that you're creating usually. And now that group has 50,000 members. I guess we started at around about, nearly, maybe just under 10 years ago. And then, I had a little bit of a following on Twitter, and a little group on LinkedIn, had one on Google Plus, but that's closed down now. Mm-hmm. And so these kind of things develop in different areas of social media. And then they kind of develop a life of their own. But with Stoicism, the thing that's peculiar about it is that there already were loads of people that are interested in this subject, but they didn't talk to each other. It's like a diaspora. They're spread all over the world and isolated from one another, really. So the best way to explain that is, actually, if you look at you can get data from Facebook on profile information. And so I know that there are 500,000 people on Facebook who mention Stoicism in their profile. But there are 1.5 million people, 3 times as many, who mention Marcus Aurelius in their profile. So there are a lot of people who have read Marcus Aurelius, but don't even necessarily think of that is connected with Stoicism. So incidentally, Marcus Aurelius never mentions the word Stoicism anywhere in his book, funnily enough. He doesn't say, he mentions it once very briefly in passing, but he never really refers to himself as a Stoic. He doesn't often use the word Stoicism. He does frequently use the Stoic slogan, which is living in agreement with nature. So we can tell from that he's talking about Stoicism. It's pretty clear from that. And from other things, but he doesn't really mention Stoicism very much. So people read Marcus Aurelius, the Meditations, and they love it, but they don't necessarily then go on to read books about Stoic philosophy. They don't kind of somehow. And that's another reason that I wanted to write a book about Marcus Aurelius, because I thought it potentially reaches a wider audience than a book about Stoicism. There are 3 times as many people that are interested in him as there are interested in the philosophy that he's talking about.
Right. And then I can see also the level of engagement that you have in this Stoicism group is just so high. Like there are a lot of discussions coming up, threads about it, and as well as like there was one interesting question actually that was posted. There was one person who asked that if there are any regular study groups that meet up in Zoom conferences or maybe meet up in real life.
Yeah.
And then that made me also think about that there is as social beings, that there is also a desire for us to meet with like-minded people. And then this is the way for us to get to not only socialize, but as well as share our passion for learning, and most especially what we share about Stoicism. And it makes me imagine on how Greece looks like having their own school of thought and being there in the auditorium or in the streets. And then this time, the 21st century, it's us sharing conversations on Facebook.
Yeah. I mean, it's weird. It's an odd thing because, so the name of the philosophy, Stoa, is a meeting place. It's a public building. So the Stoa Poikile, after which it's named, where the Stoics met, is like an arcade or you could call it a porch that's on the edge of the Agora. It's facing the city centre and the marketplace in Athens. And that's interesting because most of the other philosophical schools were either located in gymnasia, which are a little bit outside the city centre, like a park where there were sports facilities and stuff, or in private houses. But the Stoics chose to teach out in public, on the edge of the marketplace. And they did that partly because that's where Socrates had taught. Socrates famously would talk philosophy with anyone, but he often hung out in the agora and in the shops and stalls around it. And whereas the sophists, the philosophers that preceded him, mainly taught young Athenian male citizens from aristocratic families, Socrates taught men, women, foreigners, citizens, young, old, slaves, foreign immigrants. So he was kind of known for teaching anybody. Socrates basically thought, look, if you can talk, you can do philosophy. And so he opened it up to everybody, whereas previously it had been more of an exclusive or an elitist pursuit. And the Stoics kind of followed that tradition of cosmopolitanism, of embracing humanity as a whole and encouraging everyone. So that it makes perfect sense that they would have online communities. The Stoics would have loved that idea. The internet is the equivalent of the Athenian agora. It's just this kind of mixture of people. It's a marketplace. It's where everybody goes to do their shopping and stuff and to socialize and things. And the Stoics put themselves right in the middle of that, in order to kind of bring philosophy out of the ivory towers and down onto the street. My friend Jules Evans said to me once a long time ago that, you know, the name Stoic philosophy, in a sense, it kind of implies, it means the philosophy of the porch, but the kind of connotation of it, it would be philosophy of the street, as we might say today, like rather than philosophy that's in academia and in ivory towers. It's bringing it back down to the people and to the you know, ordinary people on the street level and putting it out there on the internet. And yeah, like people are very engaged with it. In terms of actual meetups, that's interesting. See, I like as an evidence-based clinician, like a psychotherapist, you know, I like numbers and I like data. And so one thing that we have numbers on is there are meetups all over the world through the website Meetup, where people can meet with other people that are interested in Stoicism and talk to them. And there are groups, and we can tell that the largest group in the world is in Toronto, where I'm at the moment. And there are, last time I looked, I think over 1,100 members in that group, which is much bigger than any of the other groups that are dotted around the world. And so we have other data that suggests that Stoicism is particularly popular in Canada. And perhaps within Canada, Toronto is maybe the kind of, for some reason, the kind of cultural centre of Stoicism. Whereas, ironically, the other place that I like to visit, Athens, there's very little interest in Stoicism, although it's the birthplace of it. And so we're hoping with the conference to help kind of reinvigorate interest in Stoicism back in the you know, its original home place. Because I don't think there was a meetup group in Athens at all, and you know, not so much interest there. Strangely, it's kind of migrated mainly to North America, to some extent the UK. It's becoming more popular in Australia, although interest in Stoicism is kind of dotted all around the world. We know we have loads of data from the Stoic Week events and other things that we run. Thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people have participated in that, fill out questionnaires for us and stuff, and we publish reports on their data. So we can see that overall it's the United States, Canada, the UK and Australia are some of the main areas where people come from who are interested in Stoicism. But I think particularly Toronto for some strange reason.
Nice. So interesting that there has been like a move or a migration from Athens, and then they migrated coming to North America. Maybe that's because that's where you are right now.
Maybe it's not. Yeah, I can take the credit for it.
Could have an impact.
I think it was already quite popular here before I came, but it's very convenient for me. So I like to give talks here and do events and stuff. So, you know, this is a good place. And also New York, there's a lot of interest in Stoicism as well. And so I guess Stoicism was born in the most vibrant marketplace in the Western world. And so it's not a surprise that it should then resurface in some of the most cosmopolitan and prosperous cities in the West.
Yeah, so I also look forward to Stoicism, to getting more in the mainstream now and having a revival. So that's it. Thank you very much, Donald. So ladies and gentlemen, that's Donald J. Robertson, author of How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, the Stoic Philosophy of Marcus Aurelius. Thank you, Donald.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.